All right, the machine says we're live. I'm going to trust that we're live. It looks like I think we had a little bit of a technical issue there before we got started, but I'm going to assume that that is past and you're all able to tune in and join the live stream. It's a Wednesday night. It's the Panther-Lair Show here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Running solo tonight. Jim he's not on assignment. He went down to Virginia. He went down to Charlottesville for the Virginia game last night, and so he is sleeping that one off. Long trip back from Charlottesville. So he's resting up, and we wish him the best. We certainly thank him for his coverage from Virginia. Jim had a lot of good stuff, both on Panther-Lair.com and right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. A lot of post-game video. Hopefully you checked it out. It was Jeff Capel talking after the game. It was who else did he have? I'm going to bring up the videos. Let me see. Jeff Capel. He had a video of Tony Bennett, Blake Hinsing, Guillermo Diaz-Graham, Ishmael Leggett. A lot of views on all of those. You should definitely check them out if you want to see what everybody was saying after the game. It's highly recommended. Great stuff from Jim, so we appreciate his coverage from Charlottesville and that big win for Pitt. You know, if there was one that you were going to go to, that was the one to be at. We all got together after the game last night and talked about it on the live show, and that was a lot of fun. I'm sure we'll have a good conversation about that again tonight as well. Lots of Pitt stuff to discuss here on this week's Panther-Lair Show. The Virginia game last night, the path ahead for Pitt basketball, some other things that sort of stood out from that game. There's one thing I just can't get my head around from that game. It's really remarkable. It's the reason Pitt won the game. We'll talk about that. Also, transfer portal movement for the Pitt football team continuing. Another assistant coach hired, another assistant coach leaves. There's some conversations to be had there. And just generally whatever you want to talk about. That's kind of how we do it here on the Panther-Lair Show. It's a bit of a call-in show, kind of, in that you can interact and join the conversation. You can post your comments and questions there in the right-hand side in the chat screen. We'll read as many as we can as we move through the show. Of course, if you want to make sure your comment gets read or your question gets answered, the best way to do it is to be a super chatter. Down at the bottom there, you can see a little $sign. You click on that thing. Throw a couple bucks to the podcast. We appreciate the support for that, and we'll make sure we read your comment or your question. If you support us as a super chatter, we always like that. Of course, you know some of the other things we always ask you to do, like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you'll never miss any of our Pitt video content. We do a lot of stuff right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We have the morning Pitt videos we do every day of the week, Monday through Friday, where we just talk about whatever's going on in the world of Pitt sports. Got one tomorrow that I think you're going to find pretty interesting. I hope you find it interesting, because I think it's interesting. We're talking about Cade Bell and quarterbacks, and maybe what Cade Bell is looking for in a quarterback based on some sort of tangible evidence. You know, we've got quotes from him about what he wants in a quarterback. We've got some sort of tangible evidence about what Cade Bell is really pursuing as the kind of quarterback he wants to play in this offense at Pitt. So we're going to talk about that on the morning Pitt tomorrow. Today we talked about some transfer portal stuff. We'll have our mailbag episode as always on Friday. Lots of Pitt basketball talk and all that kind of thing. So we do that every day of the week, Monday through Friday. We have these live streams every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. A lot of times me and Jim. Tonight, just me. We bounce around on that. We have post-game shows after every football game and after every road basketball game. So we had a fun post-game show last night. Had a fun post-game show after the NC State game. Had a really fun post-game show after the Duke game a couple weeks ago. They're good time. Hopefully, if you enjoy these live streams, hopefully you're taking part in those. And the best way to take part in all of it, to never miss any of it, is to subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications. That way you get an alert sent to your phone every time we go live, every time we post new video content. You won't miss any of it right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Spring camp is coming up. We'll have a lot of videos from spring camp, and they'll all be right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And then, of course, quick plug to the website, as always, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, and recruiting. You can find it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards to talk to other Pitt fans. All day, every day, Pitt fans are hanging out on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. You're a Pitt fan, you like to have Pitt conversations, you like to talk to other Pitt fans, that's the place to do it, Panther-Lair.com. All right. Pitt basketball, big win last night. A lot of conversation to be had about that. If you want to join the jump in and chat about it, you can do so right now in the chat screen. You want to post your comments or your questions. As I think back on that game, I mean, I think a lot of the big topics from that game, we talked about it last night, covered a lot of what stood out there, the different performances, the individual performances. Obviously, Blake Hinson scoring 27 points, double-digit scoring from Ishmael Leggett and Jalen Lowe. Bob Carrington with a great stat line of 9, 8, and 8. I mean, or 9, 8, and 6, excuse me. I mean, you love seeing that. 3 turnovers is not ideal, but 9, 8, and 6 is a great stat line for him. Guillermo Diaz-Graham came up big with a couple of three-pointers. Just a lot. I mean, a lot of things went really well for Pitt. Pitt did a lot of things really well in that game. But I'll tell you what I just can't get over. I'll tell you the one thing I just can't get past when I think about the positives from that game. You know, I want to sit down and start talking about, well, this guy did this or this guy did that. The biggest thing that stands out to me from that game and continues to stand out, maybe not as, well, I shouldn't say, I was going to say maybe not as the number one reason they won, but pretty friggin' high on the list of reasons they won, was the rebounding. Pitt lost the rebounding battle in the first half against Virginia last night, 15-14. It wasn't a big margin, but it was a margin. Virginia had 15, Pitt had 14. In the second half, Pitt out-rebounded Virginia 21-10. Now, right there, period, point blank, is a huge number. You had a plus 11 on rebounds in the second half alone. You held the opponent to only 10 rebounds. That's a monster performance on the glass. But it's not just that. It doesn't just end there with just that raw number of 21-10, okay? Because not only did they out-rebound Virginia 21-10, but they held Virginia without an offensive rebound in the second half. Virginia did not have an offensive rebound in the second half. And Virginia missed 11 shots in the second half. And they did not convert one of them into a second chance point because they didn't get any offensive rebounds. And so even though Virginia shot 52.2% from the field in the second half, and yeah, they missed a bunch of threes. They were 2 of 8 from 3. You take that down, so it's 10 of 15 from inside the arc. But not one of those 5 misses inside the arc, not one of those 6 misses from outside the arc, not one of those led to an offensive rebound and a second chance point for Virginia. And I can't get over I don't think I can overstate how big that was for Pitt to just dominate the glass in the second half like that. Now, Pitt, conversely, did grab 8 offensive rebounds in the second half and turn them into 10 second chance points. And that's big. You know, obviously that's huge. It's a huge performance. But it's the work on the defensive glass in this situation. I mean, I'm never going to pretend like getting 8 offensive rebounds in a half is not a monster number. It is. It's a monster number. But the work on the defensive glass here is what really stood out in the second half to me. Because since Pitt prevented Virginia from getting any offensive rebounds, since Pitt prevented Virginia from getting any second chance points, they really prevented Virginia from going on any kind of run. And the Cavaliers went on a run early in the second half. They scored 9 unanswered points. They went on a 9-0 run. Pitt was up 38-31, almost about 20 seconds into the half. Blake Hinson made a 3 and pushed it to a 7-point lead at 38-31. Virginia went on a 9-point run, a 9-0 run, and took a 40-38 lead. And you kind of had some back and forth after that. But at the end of that 9-0 run, Pitt called a timeout at 16:29. Virginia did not score consecutive baskets again in the second half. Final 16 and a half minutes of the game, Virginia did not score consecutive baskets. And I think a big part of the reason why is that every possession was one and done. Every time they missed, Pitt grabbed the defensive rebound. And ultimately what Pitt was able to convert that into was effectively going 2 for 1 on Virginia baskets the rest of the way. So there was that point where Virginia took the lead 40-38. The teams went back and forth for a little while until a long jumper, I think it was McNeely, made a long jumper around the 13 and a half minute mark. that gave Virginia a 49-47 lead. And that was their final lead of the game because down at the other end, Blake Hinson drained a three to make it 50-49. But really, after the 9-0 run, but especially after that 13.5-minute mark, basically every time Virginia scored, Pitt answered with 2 scores. So Virginia hits a long jump shot to go up 49-47. Hinson hits a three to make it 50-49. And then Guillermo scored on like a pick and roll to make it 52-49. 2 baskets for Virginia's 1. Virginia answers with a really sharp, well-executed backdoor cut, cuts the lead to 1. Down at the other end, Jalen Lowe makes a 3, and then Blake Hinson makes a 3, coming out of a timeout. All of a sudden, it's a 7-point game. Virginia makes a free throw. Jalen Lowe makes a little runner in the lane. Virginia gets an and 1. They don't convert it. Beekman misses the and 1, but he makes a basket, and Pitt answers with free throws from Ishmael Leggett, and then a Blake Hinson 3. Virginia makes a couple free throws. Pitt answers with a floater from Jalen Lowe, a putback from Blake Hinson, and a drive by Bub Carrington. And just like that, at that point, with 3 minutes left to go, Pitt was up 14 points. Because every time Virginia scored, Pitt answered with 2 scores. And they made sure that when Virginia didn't score, they got the defensive rebound and went down and turned it into points. I mean, just an impressive performance. So Virginia shot better in the second half than Pitt did. Virginia shot 52% in the second half. Pitt shot 45% in the second half. But because Pitt grabbed 8 offensive rebounds and turned them into 10 second chance points, and because Virginia didn't grab any offensive rebounds and get any second chance points, Pitt was able to win this game. It's great when you shoot 52%, but if you don't get any offensive rebounds off the other 48%, you're going to put yourself in trouble, particularly if you're getting dominated on the glass on both ends of the court. I think that was just, it was a way for Pitt to dominate. And this was the feeling throughout the whole game. Not that Pitt necessarily dominated the boards throughout the whole game, but there was sort of this feeling of every possession. I talked about this last night after the game. Every possession. And I think it was on both sides for both teams, for fans of both teams, for coaches of both teams, probably not for the players, but every possession, you were holding your breath until the end of the possession. If it was a Virginia possession, you were holding your breath. You're like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? And then Pitt would get a defensive rebound and you'd be like, okay. I mean, there was that kind of pressure in that game. There was that kind of intensity in that game that it felt like a postseason game. And it was played like a postseason game. And I think their players were giving the kind of intensity that you get in a postseason game. And Pitt was able to come out on top. But it was every possession that you could end with a defensive rebound felt like a gigantic win. Probably for both teams, I would say. And so that was the thing that today just kept sticking with me was that rebounding advantage. And you look at who gave the rebounds. You look at who produced the rebounds in the second half. Blake Hinson had 4, but Bub Carrington had 4. Ishmael Leggett had 8 rebounds in the second half, 4 offensive and 4 defensive. You talk about a hustle. A guy who lives and dies with hustle plays. That's hustle plays right there. And so by the end of it, Carrington finished with 8 rebounds. Leggett had 8. Hinson had 4. Jalen Lowe had 4. Guillermo had 4. Federico had 3. I mean, just team rebounding, gang rebounding, and turning it into a whole lot. Because when it came down to it, Pitt finished with 11 offensive rebounds and 13 second chance points. Just a great performance. I mean, a great performance overall, a dominant performance. The big guys, the key players were making big plays and key plays, and they went on the road and got a huge win, a great win, and kept themselves on that trajectory toward the NCAA tournament. And there's already some questions popping into the chat section, and we'll get to that in a second. Asking about why is this team ahead of Pitt? Why is this team behind Pitt? Why is Pitt not in the bracketology? I don't know. I don't understand most of this stuff. The best I can say is I look at it and they lost to Missouri at home. That's a bad loss. They lost to Syracuse at home. That's not a great loss. And while they've offset some of that by winning at Duke or winning at Virginia or winning at NC State, it's not quite enough to completely eliminate those games in all the metrics. When the committee sits down to look at it at the end of the, after the conference tournament, you'd like to think that they're going to look at it and say, all right, this Pitt team, they lost to Missouri at home. That's a bad loss. But that was in like November or early December or whenever it was. And since then, they've clearly improved a lot. Relying on freshmen, those freshmen have improved and developed and grown. And this team's playing at a really high level. This is one of the 68 teams that deserves a spot in the postseason. You'd like to think they will say that and look at it like that. But there are metrics. There are resume metrics. There are predictive metrics. Shout out to our guy Pitt Chag on the message boards for a great breakdown of resume metrics and predictive metrics. If you haven't seen it on the center court at the Pete message board, you should check it out. We talk so much about net ranking. The things that are really going to impact the committee's decision on who makes the NCAA tournament are some of these other metrics, resume metrics, predictive metrics. What have you done and what do we think you're capable of doing? And I think that was a really informative, enlightening post. So shout out to him. I appreciate you putting that on the board. And I think a lot of people can get a different perspective on things by checking out that post. So when we talk about why is Pitt in, why is Pitt not in, why is this team in, why is that team in, it's first of all, it's above my head. But I'll say this, and this will be my answer to every bracketology question as it relates to Pitt right now on February 14th. I'll say this, okay? I fully believe this team controls its own fate. And not in the sense that if they go and win the ACC tournament, they'll be in. I believe they control their own fate. I believe they're playing well enough to win a lot of these final 7 games. And I think the games that they've got provide plenty of opportunities for them to build the resume that they need to have in order to make the NCAA tournament. Obviously, it started last night with that Virginia game. Monster win. Now you get opportunities at Wake Forest, at Clemson. You get some games at home that you should win. Louisville, Florida State, not going to be pushovers, but games that you should win. At Boston College even, that are not going to pad your resume necessarily, but they're going to add to that win total, which always looks good. And certainly losses to those teams will hurt your resume considerably. So you sort of win those games out of preservation. You need to win those games out of preservation. And then you have the real opportunity games like at Wake, at Clemson, and NC State at home. Virginia Tech, again, a game that you just don't want to stumble over. Louisville on Saturday is a game you cannot afford to stumble over. You've got to take that game with as much seriousness, with as much intensity as you took the Virginia game. You need to approach it in the same way, that every possession is just crucial and you are fighting for your life on every single play. That's what they did at Virginia, and it got them the win. That's what they have to do against Louisville on Saturday night. So I got off on a tangent there, but that's my biggest takeaway on bracketology right now, is that the path is right there for Pitt. It's ahead of them, and they control their own fate. If Pitt does or does not make the NCAA tournament, it will be entirely reflective of what the Panthers do over these next 7 games. Yeah, they will determine whether or not they get in. And I think if they go 6-1 in these 7 and then win a game or 2 in the ACC tournament, maybe just 1, I got to think they make it. Depending on who that one loss is in the regular season. But I got to think they make it. They'll be what's the math on it? Forget, 23-10 or something like that. I got to think they make it. All right, let's get into some comments and questions, see what people are talking about tonight. Wolf HD kind of goes right there to the bracketology, says it's wild to me that the experts have a 13-11 Villanova team way ahead of Pitt in bracketology. Feels like it's better to lose to a good team than beat someone. It's better to lose to a good team than to lose to a bad team. And as our friend and colleague Stephen Gertz points out, the Missouri loss looks awful. I mean, that was a bad loss. And it's the kind of loss that feels like it could come back to haunt Pitt. Syracuse loss at home is the same way. as losses that could come back to haunt them. And Syracuse looks a little bit better after they knocked North Carolina off, but it doesn't make it okay though. You know what I mean? It's not gonna save you the fact that Syracuse went and beat North Carolina. I think you do root for NC State in most of its games going forward. It's funny. So NC State is really the one that I have circled right now in terms of like resumes of Pitt opponents. And I think NC State is hovering like just outside the top 75. I think, I forget if I looked this morning to see where they were, or today to see where they were, but they were like 80, right? With Pitt winning down there, if NC State could get inside the top 75 in the net rankings, it would count as a quad 1 win for Pitt. And it's almost kind of fun. I mean, you want NC State to win, right? Because you want their net ranking to climb back up because that'll look better for Pitt. It's funny, or it would be funny if you get down to the regular season finale where NC State is playing at Pitt, and it could actually, in terms of that game in Raleigh, improve Pitt's resume if NC State came and beat Pitt at the Peterson Event Center. Like, what if that would be the game that bumps them into the top 75, thus making the win at Raleigh or in Raleigh a quad 1 win? Like if Pitt beats NC State and keeps them out of the top 75, it hurts their resume. It keeps it as a quad 2 win instead of a quad 1 win. Now, thankfully, again, as that post on the message board pointed out, the net rankings are largely inconsequential, but it is funny to think that you could help your resume by losing, which to some extent you could. Now, there's obviously the counterbalance of you're now taking a loss at home, a loss that even if NC State climbed into the top 75 would not be a quad 1 loss. It'd be like a quad 3 loss. So you don't want that, or a quad 2 loss, or whatever it ends up being. So you don't want that. But it is funny sometimes to play with the metrics a little bit of the analytics, or not analytics, but play with the numbers a little bit and say, well, it could be better for them if they were to lose this game. It's not better for them to lose this game. It's not better for them to lose any games. They need to go win as much as they can. Matt Presto says, seems like the analytics and ratings that many analysts held against Pitt last year are being cherry-picked this year. Everything was about quad 1 wins last year, Pitt racking them up, and now the focus is the out-of-conference. The reality is Pitt's non-conference schedule was pretty bad. And I think you can get away with a bad non-conference schedule, but that leaves you less wiggle room when it comes to bad losses. If you don't play a great non-conference schedule, then you really can't afford to have a loss like Missouri or a loss like Syracuse at home. If they were to blow this game against Louisville on Saturday, you can't afford to have that when you don't have any extra cushion built in by playing a tough non-conference schedule. And I understand why Jeff Capel scheduled the non-conference the way he did this year. It still ended up with, 4 games against Power 5 teams? Right? West Virginia, Florida, Oregon State, and Missouri. With the Legends Classic and then the ACC SEC Challenge. But I understand why, by and large, he scheduled kind of light because he knew he was going to be relying on freshmen. And even if Dior Johnson was on the team, it was a guy who hadn't played at all. So he knew he was going to be relying on unproven players and inexperienced players. And so he scheduled down a little bit. And I understand that. But the risk inherent in that is that you haven't really given yourself a cushion in that metric, in the event of a bad loss. And so that's ultimately going to get held against Pitt, for sure, which is why you have to take care of business here and the opportunities you have to kind of lessen the impact of the non-conference schedule and some of those losses you took. Matt Presto also says, don't be so sure of a strong finish being enough. We've heard that it's not what you have done lately. It's the whole resume excuse being held against teams several times. And that's true. I just think if Pitt could finish strong here, go 6-1 in these final 7, if they could beat Clemson and Wake Forest on the road, they've already beaten Virginia and Duke. If that one loss is like Virginia Tech at home, maybe Boston College on the road, but you take care of business in the other 6 games, including a win at Wake, including a win at Clemson, including the win at Virginia, in addition to the win at Duke, and then you go and win in a game in the ACC tournament that gets you to 23 wins. You're sitting at 23-10 or whatever the math would be. I feel like you're going to put yourself in a pretty strong spot. And I think it's going to take a confluence of events, a bid stealer or something like that from a mid-major conference, to ultimately keep you out. But I think even if it means going to Dayton again, I think you could find your way in. You could work your way in with that kind of finish. I just think there'd be too, like you're right, it's not just what have you done for me lately, but I think the evidence, the strength of your performance would be too strong to keep you out, is what I would think. But again, this bracketology stuff, man, is over my head. I don't fully understand the committee. I've never understood what they go for, what they look at, what they hold against this team and what they hold against that team, and how there's not always a lot of consistency between those two. But it would seem to me, if they could go 6-1 in the regular season down the stretch here, to finish the regular season at, what would they be, 22-9, and then they go 1-1 in the ACC tournament, or 2-1 in the ACC tournament, and they're 23-10 or 24-10, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to keep them out with the sheer volume of wins that they have and the quality of wins that they've put up. Let's see. Matthew Spear says, will the three-guard lineup playing the significant minutes be sustainable down the stretch of the season, or will the heavy minutes the guards are playing and the lack of depth catch up to them? So this is something I've wondered about for a while, and I asked Jeff Capel about it 2 weeks ago. It's probably like 2 weeks ago. I asked him, like, it sure looks like a lot of minutes. I think it was after, like, maybe the Wake game, and Notre Dame had, or Bub Carrington had played like 40 minutes or something like that, and he joked about how he didn't want his coaches to know he was tired because he didn't want to come out of the game. Nobody wants to come out of the game, and I asked Jeff Capel, like, can these guys actually recover from that? To people like us, the old guys like us, I'm almost 45 years old and very close to it, and playing that kind of minutes seems very tiring to me. To all of us, that seems like a lot of minutes. It seems very exhausting, and it seems to be hard. It would be hard to do that game in and game out, even with 2 or 3 or 4, or sometimes as many 5 or 6 days off between games. And I asked him, I said, can they handle this? And he says, yeah, we don't really go that hard in practice, so it really is truly rest days between games. And good players, great players don't want to come off the court, and so they're going to stay out there, and they're going to keep pushing. And, if the play drops off, then he's going to have to make changes. Then he's going to have to, pull guys. But as long as they're playing at a high level, and I kind of look at it like, I still feel like you're running a risk. I still feel like you're running a risk of fatigue, of wearing guys down, that they hit a wall and their play starts to slip. But right now, I'm fully on board, and I've come around on this. I haven't been on this on board with this for 3-4 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago. I wasn't really thinking this way, but I'm fully on board with, going for broke, like going for broke. Like I'm not thinking about, well, I got to save Ishmael Leggett's legs. I need to keep him fresh, so when we get to the ACC tournament or get to the NCAA tournament or something like that, he's ready to play. If I'm Jeff Capel, I'm not thinking that way. I'm thinking, all right, tonight my team plays Louisville. What do I need to do to beat Louisville? Because on Tuesday night, what did I need to do to beat Virginia? And what I needed to do to beat Virginia was, play Blake Hinson 37 minutes and Bub Carrington 36 and Jalen Lowe 37, and Leggett only played like 29 minutes in that game. But that's what I'm thinking about if I'm Jeff Capel. I with the situation they're in, as far as the tournament and likelihood of making the tournament, or what they need to do to make the tournament, in this situation, you don't have, I don't think you have the space to say, okay, I want to be conservative with Blake Hinson's minutes because I know we're going to need him in the ACC tournament. I want to be conservative with Blake Hinson's minutes because I know we're going to need him in the NCAA tournament. Like, you got to get to the NCAA tournament. And the way to get to the NCAA tournament is riding Blake Hinson, Bub Carrington, Jalen Lowe, and Ishmael Leggett. and riding those guys all the way there, which means playing them a lot. If it means playing them a lot of minutes, if you need to play Carrington, Lowe, Leggett, and Hinson 40 minutes to beat Louisville, then you play them 40 minutes to beat Louisville. If you got to play them 38, 39 minutes to beat Boston College or Florida State, whatever it is, that's what you do. If you go down to Wake Forest and the game goes into overtime and you have to play all those guys 50 minutes or 45 minutes or 48 minutes, you play them 50 or 45 or 48. You do what you have to do. And if they wear out and they run down and it costs you games, then your team wore down. And it happens. But until that point comes, you need to do what you have to do to win. And if you get into some games where you can play Carrington 31 minutes or something like that, or get Hinson out with 28 minutes, like Leggett playing 29 minutes last night, great, do it. Save as much as you can. But don't save more than you can. And push it to get the wins. That's the most important thing. Because I've wondered about that a lot myself. And I've asked that question a lot. I've talked about it a lot on these live shows, and I've talked about it on the Morning Pit and wrote about it on Panther-Lair.com and all this stuff. And like, I would look at the 3-guard lineups and what they would do in the 3-guard lineups and how much they used it. I had this whole sheet. I don't know if I still have it here. Where I tracked all the 3-guard lineups over the course of like 8 games and what they did this and when they did that and how many minutes they played. They're up to 21 minutes together, or up to 27 minutes together in the Georgia Tech game or whatever it was. And Pitt was plus this or plus that. It doesn't matter right now. Like in this point in the season, in the stretch run, it doesn't matter how many minutes they're playing. What matters is the win and getting the win. And right now, Pitt's best lineup, and it's been this way for a while, Pitt's best lineup has Bub Carrington, Jalen Lowe, and Ishmael Leggett on the court together. And Blake Hinson, obviously. We've talked so long about, like, can this team get to the point where they've got 4 scorers? We talked early in the season because it was Carrington, it was Hinson, Leggett seemed to be good. Lowe has now stepped into that role where they've got 4 legitimate scorers who can all score at 3 levels. You got to have them on the court as much as you can. You get rest if you can, but the priority is getting them out there so they can produce and you can win. To the original question, let me get back to the wording of the question here. Matthew Spear said, is playing that 3-guard lineup sustainable down the stretch? And I think it has to be. You know what I mean? And you have to do it. You don't have a choice. You've got to run those guys out there because they're your best players. They're the ones who are leading you to victory. Let's see. Stephen Gertz, our good friend Steve, says you pretty much have to play those 7-8 guys a ton, especially the guards. Yeah, the rotation, last night they played 8 guys with Will Jeffers logging 3 total minutes. Guillermo got 21. Zach Austin only played 18. Federico played 19. You'll get the rotation out of the centers. I thought Federico played a pretty decent game. He was -4 in the game, but I thought he played a pretty solid game and did a good job. For what they needed him to do. Guillermo was just making some shots from the outside and I think having a pretty big impact in doing so. And so it made sense to have him in the game a little bit more, although it was a pretty negligible difference. Zach Austin, to me is you give him some chances before the first media timeout. If he makes a basket or 2, then maybe you stick with him. But even, last night he made a 3 before the first media timeout, and they still brought in Leggett at the first media timeout. Austin comes in when somebody needs a rest, when one of the guards needs a rest, whether it's Carrington, Lowe, or Leggett. With Carrington and Lowe both being able to play point guard, you can really bring in Austin for either one of those guys or Leggett. And Austin can play the 3, and guys can just move around. Whether it's Lowe and Leggett or Carrington and Leggett or Lowe and Carrington or all 3, there's so many options there because both of those guys are good at handling the point. Austin right now, Zach Austin is a starting reserve. Coaches always talk about like, well, we think about Ish as a starter. Yeah, you should. I mean, he plays like a starter. He plays starter minutes. He has a starter's role and a starter's impact. He just so happens to not be on the court for tip-off. Zach Austin, conversely, is basically playing reserve minutes and a reserve role and filling in as a reserve contributor. He just so happens to be on the court at tip-off. So Ishmael Leggett is a starter coming off the bench. Zach Austin is a reserve in the starting lineup. That's sort of how it breaks down right now. With Hinson, Carrington, Lowe obviously being starters who are starters, and then Federico and Guillermo, you just kind of play that by the night. Chris says, I really felt like Hinson and Leggett were amazing and fueled Pitt last night. They had a great game. Leggett, it was kind of funny. I mean, when you look at his stats for the night, when he finished, he had 13 points in the game. 7 of his 13 points came from the free throw line. He was 7 of 8 from the line. He had 8 rebounds to go with his 13 points. But in the second half, he attempted 9 shots and made 1. he was 1 of 9 from the floor, and it was a 3. It was a huge 3. And there's no question about that. But like, that wasn't really his impact. He made 5 free throws, which produced almost all of his scoring. He scored 8 points in the second half. 5 of them came from the free throw line, but he grabbed 8 rebounds. He had a steal. He had an assist. He was plus 13. He was hustling all over the place. He's just such a hustle player who will do basically anything. If you look at any spot on the court, on either end, offense or defense, and you look at the various things that could happen in any one spot on the court, Leggett does that. He does pretty much all of it. He shoots threes, he shoots jumpers, he drives, he rebounds, he gets steals, he dives after loose balls, he defends really hard. I don't really, I don't know how many screens he sets. I guess that's the one thing. Steven Gertz, if you're still on, you can tell us how many screens Ishmael Leggett sets. I feel like maybe that's something he doesn't do as much. But even that, I could be wrong about that. I just feel like Ishmael Leggett does everything. I don't know if I'm going to call him a glue guy because I don't know if that's exactly his role. He just does everything on the court. With a little bit of what I think we thought Zach Austin was going to be. Kind of a do-everything player that he just never really developed into. Matt Presto says, the coming out party of Jalen Lowe is such a welcome sight. He's absolutely one of those classic pick guards from years past that play years ahead in maturity and poise. The backcourt we thought Xavier Johnson and company was going to be, but never was. Yeah, Jalen Lowe's development and growth has really, I think, has been the key to this run they've been on. I mean, he's been as good as anybody. In the last 7 games, they've won 6 out of 7. In the last 7 games, Jalen Lowe is averaging 13.6 points per game, 3.4 rebounds, 3.3 assists, 42% from the field, 38.5% from 3, and 82.6% from the free throw line. 13, 3, and 3. I'll take that from Jalen Lowe. That's as good a stat line as anybody. I mean, all 4 of those guys, I've got their numbers right here. I was just calculating up earlier today, calculating the stats over the last 7 games for Hinson, Lowe, Leggett, and Carrington. And I mean, they're all really good stat lines. Hinson's a little bit above because he's averaging almost 19 points per game after he scored 27 last night. But they're all averaging more than 13 points per game. They're all getting more than 3 rebounds per game. And actually, Hinson, Leggett, and Carrington are getting more than 5 rebounds per game. Lowe and Carrington are averaging more than 3 assists per game. It's just, they're all playing at a really high level. And I think the key that has truly put them over the top has been Lowe joining that group. If it was just Carrington, Hinson, and Leggett, well, it's a little bit less of a threat. It's a little bit less dangerous. You don't have that extra guy out there who can hurt you in so many different ways like Lowe can. And Carrington can hurt you in a lot of different ways. Leggett can hurt you in a lot of different ways. Hinson has shown now that he can hurt you in a lot of different ways. Lowe now can do it too. And that just makes them so dangerous. If you switch and get him isolated on a big guy, and I think we saw this in it was the NC State game. He got on Middlebrooks or somebody, and it was like immediately, as soon as he recognized that NC State had put the center on him, boom, he burned him. He just blew past him for the layup. It was like a switch flip. It was an instinct. It wasn't even like, it didn't look like it even registered like, I see. I now have this guy on me. All right, I'm going to try and drive. Let's see if I can get past. No. As soon as that happened, boom, he was gone. It is a sign of maturity. I absolutely agree with you. It's his growth. It's his development. He's become really good, and he's a big part of why they're winning, I think. Yeah, I said, does Ishmael Leggett set any send any screens? I said that was maybe the one thing he doesn't do, and Steven Gertz chimes in. He says, almost no ball screens. He's involved in the zoom action about the same amount of screen setting as any of the guards. So that's that's like the one thing Ishmael Leggett doesn't do. But there aren't many. Wolf HD says, it seems like Jeff Capel and Pitt thrive when they have a legit sixth man. Yeah, last year it was Nike. Last year with Nike, they were at their best, and this year with Ish, at the start of the season, there was no sixth man, and Pitt needed sparks. Yeah, I mean, the sixth man, I think at the beginning of the season was Jalen Lowe, but he wasn't necessarily ready to be that guy, and then ultimately, he was when he got forced into the starting lineup due to Leggett's injury, and then he held on to that starting lineup spot and pushed Leggett into that six-man role, which worked out really well. I mean, I think they're just, they're finding that rotation that works. And to be quite honest, I mean, I think you look at last year and you look at this year, they've been at their best when they have three guards on the court. Last year, whether it was Cummings, Burton, and Greg Elliott, or Cummings, Burton, and Nike Sabandi, this year when it's Carrington, Lowe, and Leggett. That's been their best lineups the last 2 years, with the constants being, Blake Henson. And I guess Federico. But that's when they've been at their best, is when they're playing three guards. And I mean, part of that might be due to, I'm not sure did they really have another option at the three last year? Not really. Whereas this year they have a different type of player at the three in Zach Austin. He's the kind of guy they really didn't have on the roster last year. We talked about that a lot. We thought that was going to be a good thing that they didn't have a guy like him. This is a new kind of player that they haven't had before, but it just hasn't sort of come to fruition. If Zach Austin all of a sudden started becoming a factor in things, look out. I mean, this team really could go on a major run. I don't think that's going to happen. But it's kind of like the only thing that's like missing. I mean, other than obviously offense out of the center position. Speaking of offense out of the center position, Chris says, I like Guillermo Diaz-Graham. If he develops a mean streak, he could be a force inside. I mean, it's developing a mean. I don't feel like attitude is the issue with Guillermo Diaz-Graham. I don't think attitude or approach or intensity or energy, any of those things are really the issue. It's strength. He's just not strong enough. And there is a ceiling to how strong he'll ultimately ever get. And I don't know how close he is to that ceiling. I don't know, if he's there yet. I don't think he's there yet. He might never get strong enough to really compete in some of those battles down low. But if he can do some of the things that he did last night, pop out and knock down the three, which we've seen him do enough that I think we can believe that should be a consistent part of his game, or execute and finish those pick and rolls like he did last night. I mean, that's an effective player. You need some rebounding. You need him to get strong enough to offer rim protection, even if he's not going to be able to bang down low. Even if he can still get back down, he can offer some rim protection, against guards who try to drive in the lane, and that would be a good thing. And I think he offers some of that now, not as much as Federico, but some just by sheer size and length. But it's just a question of how strong can he ultimately get. And can he get strong enough to be more of a force down low on both ends of the court? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure what his ceiling is there. And that's the biggest question to me. I don't think it's a matter of energy or intensity. or attitude or any of those things. I think he's got all of that in spades. It's physical strength. The first question of the day from Brock01, I didn't even take that one first, but we were talking basketball, and Brock had a question about on the football side, so I figured we would come back to it, and so we have. Brock says, rate the Tim Doust hire on a 1 to 10 scale, and have you heard anything about the players in the defensive line receivers room looking to transfer after the coaching changes? The second part first, no. No, I haven't really heard anything about players looking to transfer. They can't transfer. There's nowhere they can go right now unless they graduated. If they're grad transfers, they could go into the portal, but the portal's closed unless your head coach leaves. And so, for some of these guys, like Ohio State just fired Chris Holtmann. Well, the portal's now open for those guys, those Ohio State basketball players. If for some reason Pat Narduzzi would leave or get fired or something like that, then the portal would open and some of these guys could go. They're not going to be allowed. The portal doesn't open because your position coach gets fired or leaves or takes another job. In the case of Charlie Partridge or Tyquan Underwood. And so any of them who might even be entertaining the idea of transferring, they're still going to go through spring camp. And spring camp is going to give Tim Doust with the defensive line and whoever gets hired to coach the wide receivers an opportunity to get to know those players, to work with those players, to build relationships with those players, and to hopefully make it so that they don't really follow through on any thoughts they might have about leaving. But we'll see. Somebody's going to go. Like, guys are going to transfer after the season. I think right now we've got them, or after spring camp, I should say. Right now I think we've got them projected at like 93 scholarship players. If all the freshmen enroll and nobody else leaves, they're going to be at like 93 scholarship players in August. That's too many. Not allowed to have that many. You can only have 85 at a time. So somebody's got to go. Guys are going to have to leave. There's going to have to be more attrition just to fit under the 85-man scholarship limit. Could they be defensive linemen or wide receivers? Sure. It's possible. It could be anybody. But guys are going to have to transfer. I'm sure players on the roster were disappointed when Charlie Partridge left to go to the Indianapolis Colts and Tyquan Underwood left to go to the New England Patriots. I'm sure guys were disappointed when Andre Powell was fired and Dave Borbely was fired and Tim Salem was fired. Probably guys were disappointed when Frank Signetti was fired. Some. It's a little extra disappointing, I think, probably for some of the defensive linemen. Particularly some of the transfers. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we sat in the South Side and listened to Nick James and David Ojebwe and Nate Matlack all talk about how they transferred to Pitt because of Charlie Partridge. That Charlie Partridge was the main draw for them to Pitt, and then not much later, Partridge is going to the Indianapolis Colts. That stinks for those guys. They were transferring to play for him specifically. That was a big part of why they transferred. I wrote an article about it because they all talked about it so much. There's pre-existing relationships with Nick James and David Ojebwe, and that was a big part of why they started looking at Pitt. Nate Matlack really likes Pitt's defensive scheme, but playing for Partridge is a big part of the appeal because he wants to be able to function as a 4-3 pass rusher and get to the NFL in that role. And now he's gone. And they're going to work with Tim Doust. I can't rate that hire on a 1 to 10 scale. I have no idea. I don't. I mean, he's coached at the Power 5 level before, right? He was at Syracuse. He's coached with Pat Narduzzi before. So, I think you would assume Narduzzi thinks highly of him and might have wanted to have him on staff for a while. I don't know. I don't know anything about him. Beyond that, nobody's really given me any inside intel on Tim Doust and how he is as a recruiter or where he's got recruiting ties or anything like that. We'll see what kind of comes out about that over the next few weeks. And we'll see what we can find out. I don't have much of a reaction. Look, here's always been kind of my take on coaching hires, coaching staff hires. Who's the offensive coordinator? That's it. That's it. That's like 95, maybe more percent of what I care about when it comes to coaching staff hires, because I've seen guys that look like they're going to be great and they don't really pan out, and I've seen guys that look like, oh, wait, you're hiring this guy, and they end up being studs. All right. The only exception is, one of the main things, and I'm going to write about this in the 321 column on Friday. You can look for this. I do think you need to have some emphasis on recruiting. I think you need to find guys who are good recruiters, who have ties into good, fertile recruiting areas, and they can go out and get you good players. But beyond that, I don't have much of a reaction to Jeremy Darvo or Lindsey Lamar or Jacob Bronowski or Tim Doust or whoever they hire to replace Tyquan Underwood. I'd like to see them get somebody who has a reputation as a strong recruiter, because ultimately that's what it comes down to. Ultimately, it comes down to to having good players. The players make the coach far more often than the coach makes the players. I think you give Charlie Partridge credit for developing Patrick Jones and Rashad Weaver and Kalijah Cansey and Jalen Twyman. He did a great job with those guys. No question about it. But they also were really talented football players. And when he didn't have those guys, like this past year, what happened to the production of the defensive line at Pitt last year? It fell off a cliff. Now, did Charlie Partridge forget how to recruit defensive linemen? Or did he forget how to coach defensive linemen? I don't think so. I think he's just as good a coach as he ever was. But the defensive line wasn't nearly as good last year as it was in previous years. Why is that? Well, they didn't have Kalijah Cansey. They didn't have Jalen Twyman. They didn't have Rashad Weaver. They didn't have Patrick Jones. They didn't have Hobble Baldonado. They're going with Devin Danielson and David Green and Tyler Bentley. They're going with Nate Temple and Bam Brema and Deion Hayes, who's still not really there. The players make the coach far more than the coach makes the players. And I know there's a lot that goes into it. I think coaches have huge impact and all this kind of thing. But I think a lot of guys know how to coach the game of football. And some are able to separate themselves because they're able to connect with the players. They're able to communicate well with the players. They're able to get the message across and explain it and get the players to understand it and internalize it and execute it and all of that. And that makes for a great coach. But you got to have the good players. Look, I'm working really hard with my fourth grade basketball team right now, okay? I want to help them understand the things we have to do if we want to win in this tournament that starts next week. About the lengths we have to go to, how we have to be willing to do this and do that, and we have to internalize all of this, and we have to understand this and that. But the reality is, they're like 2 or 3 guys, and if they play well, we're going to win because they're my best players. You know what I mean? That's what it comes down to. Is having the players. And so I don't really get too moved by who they hire for some of these assistant coach positions other than how are they as recruiters? Are they going to help you get the best players so that everybody looks like geniuses? Outside of offensive coordinator. And I think that's particularly true when Pat Narduzzi is your head coach, but that's the one spot where I think the most scrutiny is going to be, and that's where the most scrutiny should be. How is the offensive coordinator? Is he, is he good? Is he going to call a good offense? Is he going to use the playmakers? Is he going to get guys in position to make plays? And is he going to try and score? Is he going to be able to score a lot of points? And so everything we're looking at here, you can sit there and get all upset about Lindsey Lamar or Jeremy Darvo or, Jacob Bronowski or, Tim Doust. And it really only matters if Cade Bell's good. It really only matters if Cade Bell's good. And the rest of those guys need to just go recruit really good players at all positions. So I can't rate Tim Doust on a 1 to 10 scale. I don't know. It's all about the OC. Chris, Super Chatter says, Chris, the SEC and Big 12 formed an advisory council. How much should the ACC and Big 12 be worried they're going to be rated down the road? He means the SEC and Big 10. My thought on My thought on this, the whole thing, is that the SEC and Big Ten ultimately want to carve the path for the future of college football, college sports in general, but mostly college football. They want to sort of set the rules and regulations of what college football is going to look like. Maybe to some extent to keep more pieces of the pie for themselves, and maybe just to try and take some leadership and take some ownership in the sport, which I don't think is the worst thing in the world. I think the NCAA has shown itself to not be capable of leading in the current environment. And I think the SEC and Big Ten might have leadership groups that could be better positioned to forge a path forward and create sort of a new replacement for the NCAA. The ACC and Big 12 are, you have to, if you're those conferences, you are constantly on guard against getting raided. Now, you're safeguarded to some extent. You're protected a little bit by your grant of rights and media contracts that'll keep all these schools, like Florida State or Clemson, they want to make a lot of noise about leaving, but if they could do it, they would have, and they haven't done it yet, right? So you're always on guard against that. I think if you're the individual member schools of those conferences, your main focus is, how can I get a seat at the table? If the SEC and Big Ten go forward with creating a new NCAA, a new college football governing body, how can I make sure I'm involved in it? And that's your primary concern. Secondary concern is keeping your conference together. You'd like to be able to be involved with what the SEC and Big Ten do while also keeping your conference together. That probably works out better for you. But your primary goal is making sure you have a seat at the table. So ACC, Big 12, they're always going to be concerned. And they always should be concerned. That's where the SEC and Big 10 will keep looking to raid for teams. But for the individual schools, you're just trying to position yourself to have a spot when those changes come. Let's see. All right, last one. Scott Mitchell says, I think the selection committee gives no attention to conference tournament games until the championship game. 22 wins feels like the magic number if there was one, assuming the loss is on the road. Yeah, I don't know what would be the best loss for Pitt to take. You get sort of a balancing act, right? Do you gain more from beating Clemson or Wake Forest on the road? Where do you end up ahead? If you beat Clemson and Wake Forest on the road but lose to Virginia Tech, or if you go 1-1 in those two road games and beat Virginia Tech, like which one ends up with you looking better? I don't know how the metrics work out on that. It seems to me that getting the two road wins would count more than the one home loss. But it just depends. And then you also, if you're going to get those two road wins, you need Clemson and Wake Forest to keep winning. You need them to keep being good. You need to root for them to have success. I'll say this. This is my last thought, all right, as we wrap up here. The thing about all this hypothesizing and speculation and guessing about bracketology, it's mind-numbing. It's idiotic at times. It's nonsensical most of the time. We're talking completely in the abstract and generalities and vague, guesses at best, right? And if this happens and if that happens and Pitt will be this, but this will move them here, all this stuff. It's mind-numbing at times. It really is. But it's also great to be having those conversations, because it sure as hell beats the alternative of if we were sitting here and we weren't even wondering what Pitt needs to do to get into the NCAA tournament. Because that was the case 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. This is way better. Even though this stuff drives me crazy trying to speculate and guess when there's 7 more games left to play and who knows how many possible combinations of outcomes. It makes me nuts that we're sitting here on a Wednesday night talking about this, but it's so much better than the alternative. And as somebody said to me, a good friend said it after the Wake or the Notre Dame game, I forget which one, said, like, it's just fun to have these games that matter. And that's my thought too. Is it's fun to be looking at not just Pitt's games, but oh man, you need NC State to keep winning. You need Wake Forest to keep winning. Oh, if this happens and if that happens, this is going to affect Pitt and this is going to affect. It's fun to be part of that conversation. It's fun to have those conversations and have them be relevant conversations. So that's what I say. Happy Valentine's Day, because Pitt's right in the mix. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot more fun that way. For sure. All right. Thanks for tuning in tonight. I appreciate everybody who was in the chat and the super chats and all those things. Appreciate everybody who joined us for the live stream or watched the video later in the week or listened, listen to the podcast, however it is that you get it. Make sure you like this video and subscribe, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you don't miss any of our video content. And, of course, check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, for the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Football, basketball, and recruiting. It's all right here, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. All right, morning Pitt tomorrow morning, another one on Friday with the mailbag, and then Pitt Louisville at home on Saturday night. Lots of stuff that we'll have on Panther-Lair.com, lots of stuff that we'll have right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So stay tuned to all of it. Have a great rest of your night, and we will talk to you tomorrow on the morning Pitt right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.